everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Event Insights. I'm Chrissy with Safe Events Global, and joining us today we have event safeguarding specialist Lauren Stewart. Hi Lauren, how are you?
Hi Chrissy, I'm good. How are you?
Good, thank you. So Lauren is going to give us a presentation today on obviously event safeguarding. If you think of any questions throughout the presentation, pop it over into the Q&A section of the chat here on the right. We'll get to it at the end so that we don't disturb her in the meantime. This session will be recorded. I'll be posting the link on our YouTube page on Friday. And I think that's all the housekeeping. So Lauren, I will hand it over to you.
Great. This is where I have to try and do the techie bit, and this is where it inevitably goes all wrong for me. But
you got this.
How are we looking? Is everything displaying?
Perfect.
Fab. Thank you, Chrissy. Thanks so much for having me. So my name is Lauren Stewart. Thanks for the intro, Chrissy. I've got to be honest, I'm not a big fan of talking about myself, but I'll try and just do this just to give a bit of context to my kind of experience and I suppose my journey for being here today. So I wear quite a lot of different hats and hold a fair amount of different roles, but I do have a day job. I work for an organisation called Change Grow Live, which are quite a large social care charity in Europe. And within that role, I look after services for kind of young people and young adults, which kind of centre specifically around safety and have a real kind of close emphasis on safeguarding specifically. The events work, the role sees me looking after a different kind of range of different community-based settings, etc., and events kind of centre within one of those areas. So I look after services that are within kind of communities, within education settings like colleges and universities, but also the nighttime economy and kind of festival world. Alongside that role, though, I've also been working in the events industry for getting on for 10 years now, where a lot of my experience within this field kind of came from managing welfare spaces. Also kind of dipped my toe into a few things associated with kind of substances and kind of drug support within events as well. But a few years ago, I kind of saw that there was a kind of range of escalating concerns and vulnerabilities that were coming up within event spaces, which prompted me to want to look more on the safeguarding end specifically. So for the last few years, I've been working as a safeguarding advisor to the events industry, looking at advising, consulting, but also managing safeguarding provisions on site as well. So I'm going to crack on. I've got a few things that I want to talk to you about. I'm going to go through a few of the fundamental kind of elements associated with safeguarding. I will say this isn't a training session. It's just obviously kind of exploring and sharing some of my kind of insight from my role working in those spaces, looking after safeguarding based stuff. And it does come with a bit of a trigger warning as well, particularly as we get into some of the safeguarding in practice stuff. But before that, we'll look at kind of policy and processes, and I will give you a bit of a warning before we get there. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at some of the aftermath, things associated with debriefing and kind of looking after people after you've had safeguarding related incidents that may have occurred on site. So safeguarding fundamentals then, I just really quite like what this kind of looks like in the first instance. It's kind of looking at safeguarding being a reflection of what happens within communities. So when we're looking at kind of festivals and events, they are communities, and communities are complex. They come with issues, challenges, and within those communities, we've got a full social infrastructure that is designed to kind of look after those who might be vulnerable or in need of support. So we have police, we have agencies attached to social care, we have all of these fab kind of things that exist within our community that are designed to do all of these things. So it'd be a little bit naive almost to think that these things didn't necessarily translate into our kind of festivals and organised event spaces. If we've got complexities in communities, we're naturally going to have some of those complexities that are going to pop up within our events as well. So what is safeguarding and why is it relevant to events and festivals? So if I think about kind of how I've tried to structure what this definition looks like, it's been a bit of a challenge because I'm very conscious of this being a kind of global audience, and majority of my experience kind of comes from Europe. But there are a few standout statements that are kind of present across all safeguarding definitions in the majority of the world, and that's protecting individuals' health, well-being, and kind of right to safety. So there's a few things that sort of stand out for me in terms of thinking about how we do this within events, and we've already got this kind of fab infrastructure. So, for example, from a health perspective, we have medical teams on site, and I have seen some absolutely outstanding medical centres. Full X-ray suites, the works on site. We have kind of well-being centred services. We might have a welfare setup, etc., on a site. Again, work with some amazing welfare providers who have got really, really great spaces that they can welcome people into. We have security that are there to keep the peace, keep the event safe in that way, and of course, fabulous health and safety advisors that are there to kind of consistently assess risks and all of those kind of moving parts. I think it gets a little bit more complex, though, when we move into the kind of second line of that definition, though, because we then look at free from harm, abuse and neglect. And this is where the safeguarding stuff really starts to stand out. There is a standout kind of, I guess, global statement that exists within majority of countries, though, and that's that safeguarding is everybody's responsibility. So I've kind of sometimes stepped into event spaces where I've sort of asked about policy, kind of who looks after safeguarding within the event. And there's always been a bit of that sort of aligns here or that aligns there, as opposed to kind of taking that approach of actually safeguarding kind of sits with all of us within all of the event spaces that we're in. And as I kind of mentioned, there's been sort of escalating complexities within kind of communities and within event spaces. I've got a fab colleague, Lee Harvey, who said on a meeting quite recently that safeguarding never stands still. And I just love that kind of statement. I mean, I think from a kind of safeguarding officer perspective, that's quite relevant. I think often if you see safeguarding staff within events, they're usually running around like headless chickens. But I think what's really being referenced there is the fact that safeguarding is always escalating, it's always changing, the complexities are changing, the approaches, the legislation, it's never really standing still. So thanks, Lee, for that one. I'm definitely going to be using that one moving forward. So I'm going to go through some of the more I suppose common safeguarding trends and kind of themes that we see within the events world, particularly in kind of festival environments, which is where the majority of my kind of experiences come from. So I think there's kind of two ends of this that are perhaps more commonly known about. So, for example, child protection. I think a lot of people, when they work within event spaces, have come across kind of certain legislation or had experiences of dealing with child protection issues, and also the kind of accessibility and neurodiversity end as well. But there is a whole kind of host in between that that we do have to kind of give some considerations to. So when we do think about the sort of child protection end, there's a few standout things for that. So that might be thinking about physical and emotional harms to children and young people. It might be kind of considerations around sexual abuse, neglect, etc. The questions always come up around child protection. For me, when we're talking about processes and policies attached to lost children or found children, and how we kind of deal with some of those. But there's another end to kind of safeguarding around transitional age ranges. So a lot of the time, this can be those that are aged sort of 16 and 17. So, for example, we quite often see events that have opened their doors up to unaccompanied 16 and 17-year-olds, which can be a really complex and quite challenging world to navigate. I guess on the basis that a lot of legal structures are designed to protect those under the age of 18. So there's still elements attached to safeguarding with that 16, 17-year-old age range, despite the fact that the kind of event is, I guess, kind of viewing them as an adult within that space. So there can be some kind of challenges that come off the back of that. There's also a couple of other things that crop up from time to time associated with things like exploitation in county lines. If they're not kind of terminology or statements that you're used to, I really would definitely advise you to go and give them a little bit of a Google and do a little bit of your own research along those issues. But this can be examples of where young people are positioned within festival environments to, for example, deal drugs or be in those spaces to kind of undertake roles as part of kind of gang culture, for example, could be something that pops up. And quite often we can see calls come through from like parents and carers who are concerned about their young people attending events. I can think of numerous calls that I've taken where it's been like, my daughter's attending your event and she's not old enough and she's coming on a fake ID. You need to stop her. I'm like, whoa. We'll see what we can do, but it's not always that straightforward. It's quite a lot of complex issues that occur here. The next one along, we start to look at kind of victims of kind of anything really. This could be a victim of violence. It could be the victim of a sexual assault. I think this is probably the area of safeguarding that I get the most questions about, particularly in line with things like process. So, how do we support victims of sexual assault within event spaces? We then move on to mental health and kind of capacity elements. So we see lots of complex and kind of challenging mental health kind of issues crop up in events now. And a lot of that is kind of reflections of communities. As we mentioned earlier, communities are really complex. We see people entering into event spaces that already have kind of complex needs. It's not really our place to be looking at kind of the diagnosis or anything along those lines. We're just there to provide supportive environments for people to be in. There are certain conditions that can be really exacerbated and kind of it lead to increased vulnerability within event spaces. So, for example, becoming quite overwhelmed for individuals who might be experiencing issues with anxiety, for example, being in crowded spaces, panic attacks, things along those lines. Also, exploring issues associated with prescribed medications for mental health can sometimes be a bit of a challenge for events, particularly when thinking about entry processes and policies, etc., particularly for those that might be on controlled medications. And also that of kind of capacity. So working with individuals who might kind of have limited understanding within some of the event spaces as well, and how we, I guess, think about things like etiquette within event spaces and looking after each other and things like that in terms of capacity. Domestic incidents, then, I guess this is something that we see probably more frequently. Is it could be an altercation between a couple, but not always a couple. There can be some quite interesting and complex family dynamics that can exist within event spaces as well, that can lead to escalations of safeguarding concerns. Substance use, I think, particularly when we think about the sort of festival setting and some of the substances that can pop up within those spaces, and working with events to consider elements of reducing harm versus zero tolerance processes. So, how do you support people in staying safe within the festival environment when technically you've said that you've got a zero tolerance approach to drugs? Can be quite a challenging kind of process to work through. And there are some safeguarding concerns that can come up off the back of substance use as well. So, for example, it wouldn't be possible for me to attend, obviously, everything drug related. Thankfully, that's why we have fab medical welfare teams, etc., that are on site to support those processes. But there can be things that pop up from a drugs perspective around things like age of the user. If you're experiencing kind of site-wide problems with side effects, which I will talk about in a little bit more detail later on. And also messaging for drug alerts. So if you are in an event with kind of back of house testing facilities, actually how you make sure that messaging to warning, messaging or warning around substances is kind of pragmatic and appropriate. Then we've got kind of trauma and crisis management. So the kind of standout one for this is when you might have a death on site, and actually the implications and impacts that can have on so many different individuals within those spaces. So it's not necessarily just thinking about the incident, it's thinking about everybody that kind of surrounds that incident, and that's relevant for both patrons and staff as well. And as we kind of opened up talking about accessibility and neurodiversity, more than happy to say that isn't my great area of expertise. However, there's some fab practitioners out there who have got a really, really good understanding of these issues and the kind of legislation that is required when putting on events and supporting individuals with accessibility needs. But I have got an interesting example to kind of explore in a little while. So we've developed a bit of an understanding then of some of the complexities that occur. How do we then support people within those spaces? What do we do? What policies do we implement? What processes? I guess this all really starts with having a safeguarding policy. Kind of mentioned about sometimes there seems to be a bit of a tussle, if you like, between events about how to implement a safeguarding policy. And they might say, well, the welfare team have a safeguarding policy, the medical team have a safeguarding policy. But as we spoke about earlier, safeguarding is everybody's responsibility, particularly in our kind of event spaces. We've got lots of different individuals who could potentially be responding to a safeguarding concern. They don't always land in the places that they're supposed to land. And that's the kind of nature of working with humans. So having a policy that kind of regulates everybody's approach to safeguarding is really, really important. And it's actually something that we're seeing popping up more so with kind of licensing agreements, with some of the safety advisory groups, that there is actually a need to have things like safeguarding policies, etc., on site. Processes attached to lost and found children and vulnerable persons. I think a lot of events now use things like obviously the wristbanding processes to recognise a telephone number or to be able to reunite somebody who might be lost. But sometimes it's about understanding a little bit more about what that process looks like afterwards. And I can think of some examples where, for example, we've managed to make contact with a parent or a guardian of an individual, and then you get this period of radio silence for a number of hours, 3, 4, even longer hours. And then a parent kind of lands within the space to collect their child. They're under the influence, and there's this kind of moral dilemma about, well, what do we do now? What do we do with this situation? So having processes that are able to guide somebody, but with that kind of reuniting process is really important. Risk assessments, I'm definitely preaching to the converted in this space, I know that, but having a human-based approach to some of your risk assessment processes, thinking about safeguarding as a kind of standalone item. We can't prepare for everything, particularly when we're working with humans, but being able to make some preparations for some safeguarding incidents that could be likely to occur can be really helpful. A plan for working with statutory agencies. So generally speaking, there's always going to be some process attached to working with the police. Obviously, from a licensing perspective, that's a requirement. But some events, depending on obviously the size and nature, may or may not have an active police presence within the site. So thinking about what processes are being implemented to ensure that they're able to respond to safeguarding issues where appropriate, and also building up links with some of those community agencies like social care. So in the UK, thinking about social services or your local safeguarding board, just so that you've got an understanding of actually how to escalate something should it occur, particularly issues associated with like child protection, for example. It can be good to consider non-statutory agencies as well, building up links, for example, with those that are within the community to support certain issues. I think particularly stuff around domestic incidents and domestic violence, this can be a really helpful process. I can think of examples where we've had to support somebody getting into a refuge because it's been too much of a risk to send them home with their partner, as an example. So just something to kind of consider. Looking at processes for complex and sensitive escalations as well. So I mentioned one of the questions I get quite a lot at the moment is around sexual assault processes. Having a dedicated process map, which won't cover all eventualities, but gives somebody a bit of guidance on how to deal with a disclosure, for example, can be really, really helpful, particularly for the victim. Having people who are all of an understanding and kind of singing from the same hymn sheet is really, really helpful. Avoids people having to kind of retell stories, etc., which I will talk about in a little while. Having a multi-agency approach. So there's kind of lots of different strands to this. I've already mentioned about implementing a safeguarding policy, but making sure everybody understands that policy, has seen sight of it, bringing in a service level agreement, a memorandum of understanding, just something that kind of ties everybody together and makes sure that everybody is bringing that kind of pragmatic approach. And it's worth mentioning when we're looking at the implementation of a safeguarding policy, not to implement something that's too generic. It needs to be really relevant to the event and the kind of audience that you have. If you've got a higher population of young people, like say an event that's perhaps got entry for 16 and 17-year-olds, a family-based event, EDM 18 plus event, they're all going to look very different and they're going to bring different safeguarding needs, but having a multi-agency approach with a relevant safeguarding policy can be really helpful. And finally, bringing in an appropriate trained person to have that level of accountability, or recognizing somebody within your existing leadership structures that can lead on safeguarding related incidents is really, really helpful, and is actually something that we're seeing more frequently feature within licensing kind of requirements, that there is a dedicated safeguarding lead within the site, and somebody who can take that kind of professional accountability, but also somebody who can help I suppose coordinate this multi-agency approach. So for example, someone who might be able to provide some training, some site briefings, who can have that level of accountability for the various different agencies that are serving safeguarding functions within the nature of the site. So there's a whole host of different guidance and legislation. I spoke quite heavily about licensing, thinking from my experiences specifically in the UK. Actually, we're seeing very, very specific items pop up now within safeguarding kind of segment within licensing conditions, like say requests for a DSL, requests for a policy, requests for sight of these policies, etc., in advance of the event being granted the green light to go ahead. And I know that this is something that's popping up in different places kind of across Europe now as well, where there is this kind of designated kind of role or requirement that's being put within to some of the stuff associated with like the Licensing Act. So thinking about some of the processes attached with, Challenge 21, Challenge 25, depending on where you are in the world. And also things like kind of welfare request guidance as well. So Asperangela schemes, etc., they're actually being built into licensing requirements now. I've seen a few examples of those. And also some of the stuff attached to the Safety Advisory Group as well, requesting that your DSL is in attendance at those SAG meetings seems to be a bit of a feature as well. There's a whole host of legal guidance, kind of social infrastructure documents, etc., that provide that kind of guidance. An example of this in the UK is Working Together to Safeguard Children. When we're looking a little bit further afield, so when I was conducting some recent work out in the Middle East, they have kind of human rights convention documents, etc., that reference safeguarding within those, and they're all relevant to the kind of events industry as well. And then finally, looking at those due diligence kind of processes. So stuff like background checks. So for example, in the UK or in Ireland, we use processes attached to DBS and vetting. These are really, really important if you've got individuals who are responsible for vulnerable people within your event spaces. It's not necessarily the onus of the event to undertake these checks, but it's important that the kind of event are, I suppose, regulated in a way where they make sure that these checks have happened, and that the people that are working in those spaces are kind of right and are suitably trained in order to support vulnerable people within those spaces. So I think the bit that probably everyone's most interested in is going to be around safeguarding in practice. And I've just got a few kind of comments to add before I get into the nitty gritty. These are all safeguarding related incidents that I've been involved with specifically. And I guess I want to give a bit of a trigger warning, as I kind of opened up with saying, we're all humans and we can be impacted in different ways. If we're going to kind of unpick a few issues, we need to be really, really kind of cautious about our kind of own well-being, but also thinking about the well-being of those that perhaps were involved within these incidents as they occurred. So with that in mind, I've made sure that all of these accounts are sanitized. But I do appreciate that the events industry, whilst it is big and vast and wide, I do understand that some of you may potentially have been involved in some of these events. If I could politely ask if you are aware of the event, just not to reference the name of the event, just so that we can be really mindful and really kind of protective of the individuals that were involved. So particularly giving sensitivities to perhaps families and victims, etc. But yeah, I'm going to go through and have a bit of a chat about them. Some of them are more interesting than others. Some of them are a little bit spicier than others. Some of them really complex. Some of them not so complex, but quite typical. So I will open up with perhaps a more common incident, but one that occurred in an event space quite recently, which was a female 19 presenting with a broken nose. She goes and self-presents to the medical team. The female's intoxicated. It's initially unclear about how the injury occurred, but the charge nurse requests safeguarding assistance. So some good kind of safeguarding background from that charge nurse. Gentle probing ascertains that the female has been assaulted by her partner. Pictures of the accused are obtained and is located by security. The female does not wish to, at this stage and in the current condition, to take any further action, but there are impartial witnesses that come forward to confirm the female's account, which results in the male being evicted from the site. So I think it's important just to note that we do need to be really kind of appropriate when thinking about working with victims and actually what the victim might want in that instance. It's not always possible that they get the outcome that they want. You know, there can be some really kind of challenging factors that we have to negotiate, particularly when the police are involved in certain incidents. But generally speaking, we do try and act in the interest of the victim. So things to note in this particular case, safeguarding centred proactive approach from the medical staff resulted in us being able to kind of, I suppose, deal with this issue in a much more appropriate way. There was definitely some patience required with the female. I think, you know, bearing in mind this was a sensitive situation and when working with somebody who was quite heavily intoxicated as well. The female required support in accessing community interventions afterwards as well. She wanted to make sure she engaged with a domestic violence service after the event. So we made sure that there was access for her to be able to do that. We needed to make sure she'd got a safe space to spend the night. This was a particular event that had camping on site, so we needed to make sure that she was okay and supported within those spaces. And we needed to give her some support in her onward journey getting home as well, because she'd arrived at the event with her partner. Where this one got, I suppose, a little bit more interesting was that the male actually went on to regain access to the site using a different name. He'd somehow managed to evade security and get access back onto the site. It was by a pure coincidental nature that the person that he happened to present to when trying to regain access to her was me. So he came face to face with me out of an event of over 100,000 people in attendance, somehow managed to land himself on my doorstep. But that particular action in itself actually then resulted in his arrest because it was recognised that he was trying to aggravate the situation further. But yeah, this is not a too uncommon type of incident that we might see occur in the event space, particularly where you've got alcohol involved, for example. You know, we're dealing with, like I say, the kind of complexities that exist within the community can translate into events as well. And in further discussions with the young woman, it did transpire that there had been a history of domestic violence within that relationship already, hence wanting to access community support afterwards. So this particular incident relates to a matter of child protection. So security are actually alerted in this instance to reports of a child that's locked in a van within a camping area of the event. Staff camping area of the event, to be more specific. The van is located where a 7-year-old female is found. She appears to be well and in good spirits, advising that her father is working. The van is opened by force. The female escorted out by security into the kind of safety of the safeguarding team. The account, condition and behaviour and the language used by the child raises additional safeguarding concerns though. So sometimes I suppose this is just about highlighting that at face value, some things that, I mean, I suppose in this instance didn't look very good to start off with, but yeah, it's a gentle probing and kind of questioning can lead to a much more complex situation. The father later returns to the van, alerting security that his daughter's missing. He's heavily intoxicated and he's on site as a trader. So he's actually kind of there in a professional capacity on the site. The daughter's been in the van for a number of days, it transpires, again, using that kind of gentle probing with the young person. So things to note, the police were actually really wrapped up in dealing with another major incident as this was occurring, and as the male presented, he became more and more agitated whilst waiting for an outcome, because we weren't really sure how we were going to navigate this one without taking further advice from the police. We ended up having to get social care involvement because an emergency foster placement was required for this young female. There was traffic management issues, etc. as well, but it took a number of hours to get a trained and suitably qualified individual on site to come and take control of the person to get them into an appropriate foster placement. with this one, the male is actually arrested, but what happens is after this initial incident's kind of been resolved, it then transpires that there's another child on site within his care, and he's actually working on site in an underage capacity as well. So again, additional complexities are then added to that situation, resulting in further need to have a kind of approach with social care in order to make sure we've got this other young person supported as well. So capacity then. Intoxicated male 27 escorted to the ejection centre following an altercation with another patron. Very agitated. The staff handle it very well though. Lots of dignity, respect. The guy's just not calming down. Judgment call is made that he needs to be evicted, needs off-site, and then this is based on their kind of evictions policy. Is escorted to the assigned gate as per the policy, removed from the site. A few hours later, though, there's a road traffic collision on a rural country road just outside of the event, where a pedestrian struck by a vehicle and is in a critical condition. So whilst the male was treated with kind of dignity and respect, there wasn't a formal process actually in place with this event to actually identify if there are any capacity or vulnerability issues. So the male had money and a phone, so it was assumed he can kind of get home fine, but actually the level of intoxication and his understanding about what was happening was really, really impaired. It's later discovered that the pedestrian is the male that was evicted from the site earlier. This results in the event needing to introduce a range of kind of vulnerability assessment measures, particularly for ejections, thinking about the nature of the event and where it was kind of positioned within the rural setting, but also surrounded by quite busy rural unlit roads, for example. There were quite a lot of kind of complexities that came with that after the event, as opposed to it being about what happened actually on the particular day. Sexual assault and rape. Female 17 approaches a trader at 5 a.m. requesting help. She's wearing a hoodie and a blanket wrapped around her waist. She appears distressed and disorientated. The trader requests assistance from security, and whilst waiting, the female discloses that she believes she's been the victim of a sexual assault. Security attend where the female becomes distressed. She's crying. She's asking them not to hurt her. The trader passes on the information made in the disclosure in an attempt to reassure her. The security staff acquire a hot drink from the trader and escort her to the welfare space where safeguarding support is immediately requested. So things to note. Unfortunately, security didn't follow the process for responding to sexual assault, resulting in a potential loss of evidence. So, for example, by offering somebody a drink, that can be a bit of a challenge when you're looking at sexual assault kind of processes for obtaining evidence. Due to the level and the way that it was escalated, the victim was actually forced to disclose to several parties, which is not very kind of trauma informed. Now I'll talk a little bit about kind of being trauma informed in a little while as well. So in terms of next step, following liaison with welfare, safeguard and event control, the police are contacted to support. It's a smaller event, so there's no police presence on site, so it does take them a little while to attend. During this time, the female discloses that she thinks the perpetrator was a member of staff. So that results in a conversation with event control in order to obtain some CCTV footage, which does actually show a male steward entering a tent. Managed to detain him by security, though, whilst pending response from the police. Substance use then. So over the duration of a weekend, the medical and welfare teams receive a number of presentations. Individuals are demonstrating extreme levels of paranoia, including erratic behaviour, very concerning statements. A particular male expresses he believes there's a deceased infant buried under his tent. Female expresses that she believes her partner is recording and exposing her. Male screaming that a member of the welfare staff has a knife. Escalations and presentations just continue over several hours, resulting in a very overwhelmed kind of number of services, not just welfare. You've got the medical team are becoming overwhelmed with these issues, security, etc. Things to note: bringing security and a police presence within that space appears to make the situation a lot worse. It increases the level of paranoia. again, making the situation a lot more difficult to manage. There is a back-of-house drug testing facility available at this particular event. However, there's quite a significant backlog of substances that have been brought forward for amnesty or via seizure upon entry. So a coordinated approach is developed, sensitive and general conversations resulting in amnesty of a substance. So I was able to sit down and obtain a sample for testing. This shows the substance N-ethylpentalone, which is a cathinone that's got some very extreme side effects. From this test, they were able to generate a site-wide alert and a plan to support those in current crisis. So, for example, working with the medical team to look at if there's kind of benzodiazepines that can be prescribed or given to individuals in order to kind of calm the situation down, resulting in reducing the likelihood of services becoming further overwhelmed. Accessibility and neurodiversity. So I said I've just got an interesting example associated with this, and it is a little bit of a sad one, but safeguarding support is requested to aid issues within the accessibility area of an event. A male, 31, is in a distress state. He has an assistance dog who also appears to be distressed. The accessibility staff support the male to disclose that another accessibility customer has struck the assistance dog after the dog had jumped up at him. The male reported that the dog's behaviour was now different. He was scared that he was going to be actually ejected from the event because his dog was barking due to the kind of distress that this incident had occurred. Things to note, both of these customers had accessibility and neurodiversity needs. This made this issue obviously quite complex in itself. And the reason I wanted to bring this one to light is this is my first instance of dealing with what could effectively be considered a bit of an animal welfare case as well. So next steps then, a coordinated approach is developed. The male's reassured that he will not be ejected based on the behaviour of the dog. However, we want to make sure the animal's welfare is considered within the situation. I'd got visions of me needing to put signage out across the site saying, is there a vet on site to come and deal with this? But did have the thought process of perhaps there may be a dog handler on site that would be able to just come and provide some additional reassurance to the situation. And there was, thankfully, a police dog handler was able to attend to support. The male who struck the dog was engaged in a sensitive discussion with security and moved into another area of the accessibility space. Again, it just felt like it wasn't the right thing to do to be quite punitive to that individual. So we tried to make sure that everybody was kind of happy. And then the following day, we were able to get the individual off site as well with the dog, so the dog could go and get checked out properly. But yeah, this was a kind of new one on me, so I thought it was worth bringing into this space. And finally, just going to kind of unpick this quite complex drug-related death. And I will kind of open this one up and say this is the one that you're probably most likely to be familiar with. This was, I think, one of the sort of career-defining incidents for me that really kind of pushed me more on the safeguarding end rather than my previous roles, obviously looking after welfare kind of spaces. But a call's received to the customer hotline. A mother is expressing concerns about her daughter who is at the event. The staff member offers reassurance, advising many parents have concerns about their children at events. Parents not really satisfied with this response. They drive over 100 miles to the event, having received number of distress phone calls from their daughter. They're denied entry to the site by security, and security on the gate agree to use the Find My Friends facility on the father's phone to locate the daughter, despite this being against the guidance of event control at the time. The security staff member with a colleague is guided to a location just outside of the event site where he finds the unresponsive body matching a description of the female, and she's confirmed to be dead upon arrival to the site-based medics. So numerous things to obviously note within this case. There are numerous staff involved in this incident. They report things like guilt, trauma, distress in the hours that follow. A complex incident involving substance use, which actually results in the arrest of a male as well. This particular case picked up high profile media interest very quickly. So from a safeguarding perspective, the event became under quite a lot of scrutiny very quickly. Safeguarding involvement is required in the days following the event as well, including like additional levels of kind of scrutiny of notes, which were required as part of the investigation. So this resulted in having to have a kind of active presence within the site, both physically and via phone, etc., in order to continue to support this event for a number of days afterwards. Which I guess brings us on quite nicely to those kind of elements associated with debriefs and those kind of curious questions that it can be helpful to explore in the aftermath of an incident that occurs on site. It's always really helpful to consider what the debrief process kind of looks like. How do you have debriefs generally? I appreciate there's a lot that happen, but are there any specifics that you would undertake in relation to safeguarding or kind of looking at the responses to kind of trauma or crisis management within spaces? It's always good to think about a learning culture and not a blame culture. So when I was going through those examples, there are levels of obviously accountability within certain functions, but actually thinking about how can we learn from this, be that to stop it happening again, or if there's any learning that can be taken where should, I suppose, similar nature kind of incidents occur, how we can better support individuals and staff as well. What was within our control? A lot of the time, safeguarding incidents can't be risk assessed for. We're working with humans. So, was there anything within our control, and what was out of our control? And are there any additional mitigations we can put in? How do we support the staff involved, particularly when we're looking at some of those trauma kind of crisis type issues that occur, can take its toll on the individuals that are involved with those processes? What does learning look like? How do we implement it? How do we make sure that these debrief processes aren't, tokenistic? How do we embed things? How do we amend policies, amend processes to reflect the learning? And also, what level of recording and monitoring are we taking? So if we're actually responding to safeguarding incidents, where are we recording them? Where are we noting what's happened? Do you have a process that's a paper process? Are you using platforms like Halo, for example? What does that recording kind of look like, and how can we re-access some of the monitoring to make sure that we can consider that as part of that kind of aftermath debrief process? Which kind of brings me to the sort of end statement for me, which is around being trauma informed. The process of being trauma informed and working in a kind of trauma informed workplace is that of considering that we all bring trauma into spaces. We've all got complex lives, we've all experienced things. I think particularly when we're working in organised events, festivals, we deal with really complex, challenging issues, and we want to be able to step away from those environments feeling okay. And we want our patrons to walk away from those environments having had a good time and feeling well. And even if they have experienced something of great kind of trauma, etc., that's been well handled. And that brings us to, I guess, bringing a sense of physical and psychological safety, and thinking about environments that we can manage trauma within those, real fast-paced spaces. So is there a particular space that we can take people to that feels safe, both physically and psychologically, where we can allow for time and space? And like I say, this is really applicable to staff as well. We have to acknowledge that trauma can impact decision making. So we have to think about how we support individuals, particularly those that do have to take decisions at a high level, with making sure that they feel well and comfortable and confident in the decisions that they are taking. We should lead events with empathy. We should think about those challenges that do exist within our communities and how they do reflect into events. And I suppose ultimately bringing a sense of kind of shared value into the event space, and everybody, like I say, kind of opened this whole statement up with talking about how safeguarding is everybody's responsibility. How do we share those values? How do we do things like provide training? How do we provide support to staff, to our customers, etc.? Really would advise you all to look at trauma-informed workplaces and how you can make your spaces more trauma-informed when working with individuals. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I feel like I've waffled on for long enough at you. But just before I do, I am going to open up for questions, but just a couple of little nods, if that's okay. Just want to say a big thanks to WellSafe CIC and Events Wellbeing, who are two fabulous welfare providers that are working across the world, providing some great safeguarding approaches. A nod to my colleague Lee Harvey, who has really influenced a lot of my own safeguarding practice. So thanks, Lee. And of course, a big thanks to Safe Events Global for having me today.
Lauren, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. Really great presentation.
Thanks, Chrissy.
If anyone has any questions, don't be afraid to pop them in here before we let Lauren go. We did have a couple of people, Lauren, who just said they had to pop off before the end. They said they're going to catch the end on Friday. Honestly, fantastic presentation. I suppose, as you said, because there's so much human involvement, you can't really do a full risk assessment beforehand. because there's so many different things that can just pop up on the day. I would imagine, though, there's some sort of like tabletop kind of things that you go into different scenarios ahead of time and at least give people an idea of the kind of things that could go wrong and what to do in those situations.
Absolutely, yeah. A lot of the processes that I can be attached to, particularly where there are specific licensing conditions that are implemented around safeguarding. So, for example, having an external safeguarding provision will involve me being a part of those tabletop exercises. And I've been pulled into tabletops about some weird and wonderful things that don't necessarily at face value kind of align with what my kind of approach to safeguarding is. But then when I start to unpick some of those, so things like traffic management and thinking about that particular case that I spoke about with the individual who was hit by the car, yeah, you can kind of see where safeguarding is embedded across all different parts of the site and all different parts of the kind of structures and social infrastructures as well.
100%. It's almost like a bit of a ripple effect outside of the incident itself and then leading out and out to different parts of the event. Definitely. Fantastic. Okay, well, it looks like there's no questions coming in. And to be honest, I'm not surprised. That was a really thorough presentation. You did a fantastic job. So I will leave you go at that. Thank you very much for your presentation. And thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
Cheers, Lauren. Have a great day.
And you. Bye-bye.